They also did their homework, researching pastoral blogs and online statements of faith, eliminating options that didn't seem doctrinally sound. Once they were sitting in a pew, or more often a row of padded chairs, they paid close attention to the sermons, asked questions during the pastor meet and greets, and spent several weeks attending likely candidates. They didn't view themselves as especially partisan, but they also didn't view issues like abortion and the definition of marriage as political. These were matters of spiritual conviction. And they knew that whatever church they settled in, it had to have biblical positions on sexuality and the sanctity of life, even if those subjects were rarely addressed from the pulpit. "It wasn't as easy as you might think," said James. "You kind of had to listen for the buzzwords and know how to interpret them. Like if the pastor talked about how Jesus came to fix our brokenness, you knew that probably meant sin. And that was especially true if he applied brokenness to sexuality. You knew what he meant, but wasn't willing to outright say." It took a few months, some trial and error, and a couple of extended false starts, but eventually they settled into a church that, if a little lacking in theological depth, still felt like a place where they could grow among like-minded believers. Now, as she sat before the LED glare of her laptop screen, scrolling through the search returns for Women's March and Pussycat Hat, Bailey felt disoriented. Climate change, LGBTQ rights, workers' rights, immigration reform, racial justice, abortion. She had some sympathy for one or two of the grab bag of issues this march was supposed to represent, but she couldn't understand why Christians would want to take part in an event almost entirely opposed to a holistic understanding of biblical ethics. "I was so naive at the time," she told me in a soft Southern drawl. "I didn't even know what the hat meant, that it was supposed to represent female genitalia." More than disoriented, she was discouraged. Even in LA, church was supposed to be the one place her family could find fellowship with other committed Christians. The couple wrote the experience off as a locational hazard. "We just assumed it was California," James said. "What are you going to do?" When they moved back home to Georgia a year later, they thought things would be different. Safely ensconced back in the Bible Belt, they figured they'd plug right back into the megachurch they'd left. But it, too, had changed. The pastor had always embraced a seeker-sensitive model, meaning the worship style, pop and rock, and sermon focus, practical life improvement, were designed to be as inoffensive and culturally familiar to non-Christian visitors as possible. But in the intervening years, sensitivity had tipped over into the doctrinally dubious. One weekend, the pastor preached a sermon in which he suggested that some of the Bible's moral standards were no longer applicable to modern society. He was cagey about what he meant, but he would later imply it's unloving for believers to define homosexuality and transgenderism as sins. By then it was 2019, and some church staffers invited James to join a racial reconciliation study group titled Be the Bridge. Once there, he was told that new white members weren't allowed to speak for the first 6 months. They were only to do the work of listening and completing a Whiteness 101 reading list. James abided by those rules for a few weeks, keeping notes on his now glaring concerns. Even more than the division this particular curriculum seemed sure to stoke, he was alarmed at how the instructors were applying it to broader areas of life. "I started noticing that a lot of the discussion centered not just on racial justice, but on quite a lot of leftist causes. The women who led the group would frequently talk about oppressed-oppressor dynamics. At one point, they told us we needed to read more books from queer authors because they were an oppressed group too. And that's when it really started to click for me that this was a slippery slope to all sorts of dynamics." James never made it through the probationary period. When another white member who had managed to stay mute for 6 months got sent back to a 3-month talking timeout for politely challenging the moderator's claims regarding police shooting data, James left the group. The straw that broke the camel's back came one Sunday when the worship pastor told the congregation that God went looking for Adam and Eve after they ate the apple because he wanted to tell them, "There's nothing you could do to ever separate you from my love." I just turned to Bailey and said,